a year ago last summer, I was doing an investigation and I had to remove a baby for a mom who was using fentanyl and heroin.
Mischa Martin, Director of Arkansas Department of Children and Family Service, discussing the devastating effects of substance abuse on the family.
I think she wanted to change. And frankly, in the moment when I'm removing her baby, she had very maternal instincts. Can I hold my baby? Can I just love on her? Absolutely. Because I'm sitting here and you're safe for the moment. Absolutely. And she held and she embraced her. And her words said that she loved her and her actions said she loved her. There was no way I could leave that baby with her. I won't go into all the circumstances. It was a very bad circumstance. But do I believe that mom wanted to change? Absolutely. But she had been addicted to heroin and fentanyl for 10 plus years. She was in her late 20s. I think that addiction was stronger than her ability to change.
This is season 1, episode 2 of the SmartJustice podcast, substance abuse and the power of addiction.
Crime and punishment are hot topics. Are there solutions different than what we're hearing about at a national level?
We led the nation in all the wrong categories, especially when it came to child welfare and recidivism. Like, why are we dead last?
Now we're seeing illicit fentanyl as the #1 drug threat in our state, backed very closely with methamphetamine.
If you really want to focus on the kids, stop acting like you're going to use foster care to punish parents.
There is a different way to approach justice that has better return on investment.
Working with families on the prevention end is more cost effective than placing them in foster care.
That seems to strengthen both law enforcement and courts and tie that together with community resources.
Justice has to be served for civil society to exist, but the place of mercy falls in the hands of the people.
And then track the impact to communities and better outcomes. And we're calling this approach SmartJustice.
SmartJustice is a work of Restore Hope and partner organizations. Restore Hope is a software and services organization that helps communities achieve better outcomes for justice and child welfare efforts. SmartJustice is focused on optimizing the system by improving the relationships among its parts.
I am Charles Newsom. This first season of SmartJustice focuses on the big issues that tear families apart. And the first issue is substance abuse. Here's Paul Chapman, Executive Director of Restore Hope, Arkansas, talking to the podcast producer, Ed Lowry.
Substance abuse is probably the most common factor in child welfare issues and incarceration or felony level crimes. Substance abuse is the factor that seems to be most prevalent in all of these issues. So I wanted to go ahead and make sure that we get a good definition. Substance abuse, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, which is in the industry, publishes a lot of the kind of key baseline data. Substance abuse disorder, or SUDS, occurs when the recurrent use of substances, which could include prescription drugs, illegal drugs, or alcohol, causes clinically significant impairment, including health problems, disability, the failure to meet major responsibilities at work, school, or home. You know, as we talk about justice-involved families and our need to respond smartly or better, then we're going to have to deal with the prevalence and the commonality of substance abuse and substance abuse disorders.
We visited with Arkansas Drug Director Kirk for a current picture of drug abuse issues in the state.
We've always been a strong methamphetamine state, drug of abuse for the most part up until 2 years ago. Methamphetamine was our #1 overdose death drug in the state. Now we're seeing illicit fentanyl as the #1 drug threat in our state, backed very closely with methamphetamine. And we realized that illicit fentanyl is being mixed into everything, whether it be methamphetamine, cocaine, marijuana.
So we've been in an opioid crisis for a while now, for many years. But it really started with prescription drugs. When we made it harder to get the prescription, folks would go to heroin, which has been around for a long time. But where technology has really impacted us around the opioids is fentanyl and other synthetics like that. The way that opioids work is the feeling, the high that folks are kind of after is pretty close to not breathing any longer, so death. And so that's why we see all these overdoses. People just take too much.
Drug cartels are realizing synthetic drugs are cheaper to make, less intrusive by law enforcement. The amount of powder that you get in a sweet and low package is enough substance to get 1,000 people high, but it's also enough substance to kill 500 people. So a little bit goes a long way when you mix just some micrograms of that into another substance. You know, they're seeing illicit fentanyl mixed into liquid or into a liquid and then into an eyedropper or a nasal spray and sprayed into a drink for a date rape type drug. These fake pills that are stamped from a stamp that you can buy off eBay that shows to be Xanax or Oxycontin or oxycodone that actually is fentanyl laced or fentanyl pressed onto the pill. DEA has told us that 4 out of every 10 pills contains enough fentanyl that can be a fatal overdose. And we've had seizures of 30,000, 40,000 pills at a time in our state already. So you imagine 4 out of every 10, that's how many lethal doses that are out there that are being seized by law enforcement right now. The more potent a drug is, the more attractive it gets. Baltimore, Maryland put out a warning when fentanyl first came on the scene and they saw it on a particular street there, and I don't remember what the name of the street was, but say 3rd Avenue or something like that. And they put out a deal about be careful about the drugs that you're getting in there. We've had several fatal overdoses. And all of a sudden, the number of people that were coming down there drug seeking, it just flooded them because of that public service announcement they put out there.
For a dealer, having someone die from your drug is almost good marketing?
It is.
Because that tells people
how potent your stuff is. And there's always that mindset that I can take this, I have built up my tolerance. Because the first time you use drug is the highest you're gonna get off that drug. And so what happens is your body adjusts to that, and then you're never gonna get as high the second time unless you keep using more and more and more and more. That's what they call chasing the dragon, always trying to get that next higher high than you've been. That's why they said, you can chase the dragon for so long, but what are you going to do when you catch it?
So substance abuse can lead to several problems in the ability to create a healthy place in which kids can grow up and thrive and develop. If you're impaired, if you drink too much, then your behaviors obviously are going to be impacted. And that's not necessarily the best place to be when you're trying to help your son or daughter get through math homework.
Right.
Or show up on time.
Yeah.
That's also going to impact your ability to perform at work oftentimes. And as soon as it starts having impacts on your major responsibilities, all of a sudden now we're moving in, according to that SAMHSA definition, now we're moving into a disorder.
Right.
This is different than having a glass of wine or some beers with your friends and enjoying the company and the situation. Now we're starting to see these impacts on major responsibilities in your life, and especially for children.
We're seeing a large amount of drug-endangered children, kids that are living in homes where mom and dad or the caretaker are utilizing drugs, not caring for their kids, and a lot of our kids are suffering from neglect. Poison control has seen rises in youth coming into hospitals and information coming in there about younger children that have come into contact with chemicals, chemicals such as marijuana or high-grade marijuana that has large THC content, or illicit fentanyl and other type drugs that are around the home or mixed into things in the home that our young people are getting into. So as society starts to normalize drugs and drugs become more acceptable, we need to realize that any drug use today can be a fatal experience, which means that any drug can kill you regardless of what you know about it, what you think about it, what you believe to be out there. If they mix too much fentanyl, and you could be 1 microgram too many in that substance, would be the difference between life and death, and that's what we're seeing.
One of our responses to that through law enforcement and medical professionals was to make sure that a lot of first responders and other social service professionals is to use a blocker or an inhibitor. Naloxone is one. There's some injectables now. I carry an injectable in my car that if I come across someone that I'm suspect of ODing, that we can try to bring them back before death. And that's happening a lot now. So much so that Chief Baker in Fort Smith said that if his officers and the EMTs weren't trained and didn't have the supply, that Fort Smith couldn't handle all the funerals that are going on at the moment.
Families should, if their son or daughter or loved one is messing with drugs, they ought to learn how to have Narcan, just like if you had matches in your house, you ought to have a fire extinguisher. Narcan is a way for somebody to breathe during an opioid overdose. And as we know, they may not have an opioid addiction, but they may have an addiction to some other substance that may have illicit fentanyl mixed into it. So having that Narcan can make the difference between life and death.
We also hear the term addiction. Is there a difference there, and where does that line fall between someone who's abusing substances versus someone who's truly an addict by definition?
Right. The way that I've heard it described by an addiction specialist doctor was that there are situations and environments in which it makes it much more likely that folks would start drinking more, like think college, right? Or in a depressed community where hopelessness is very high, you're much more likely to use drugs or alcohol as an escape. And you can absolutely become addicted to substances in that way. But true addiction, according to this doctor and his studies, occurs. There are a certain percentage of individuals who, when they have that euphoric feeling from drugs and or substances for the first time, they find the state of mind and existence that they want to live in.
It is one thing to hear a doctor's clinical definition of addiction. It is another to have lived the experience. For their perspective, we spoke with Jimmy McGill.
Somewhere around 17, I found the drug of the love of my life, which was my drug of choice. And from the second it hit me, I knew this was it. This was what I was made for. And I wanted to die knowing I tried every kind of that drug that I could try. My name's Jimmy McGill. I'm a person in long-term recovery from the disease of addiction. I have not used a chemical or a substance in 7.5 years. My history is pretty dark. You know, as far back as I can remember, I've been surrounded in an atmosphere of addiction and violence. And I think my earliest memory of that I can clearly visualize, I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and I had to hold my dad's arm off so that he could find a good vein. And I remember knowing that if I moved wrong, his vein would shift, and it may cause him to miss that injection, in which case could result in me getting hurt. And I remember associating those two things together, right? Like, be really still, because if he doesn't get high, I get hurt, you know? He was a really violent person. He died from an untreated disease. And that's the thing about substance use disorder, right? Like, it expresses itself in a way of isolation that makes detection and diagnosis almost unrecognizable, which makes treatment almost unrecognized, right? Like, you can't see the need for it because of the isolation that addiction pushes us to. And so my father was no exception to that. He was unaware that he was a person of addiction. He thought he just used because that was the life that he had. And I'm not dishonoring my dad in any way. I don't mean that any of that for that, right? Like, he was literally my best friend. And in the end of his life, he was all I had. And so he did the best he could with what he had and what he knew. But he was a hard man to live up to. In my household, what determined the level of manhood was the amount of violence that was shown in you, right? Like, you accept this, you don't accept that, you never let anyone take anything, you don't have to ask for permission unless you're too weak to take it. And that was the mindset that I was bred and brought up with. And that mindset led me into active gang activity. In that atmosphere of child neglect, a thug was born. So despite all these disadvantages that I had always had, these feelings of inadequacy and neglect and the abandonment issues, and I'd been sexually molested by a babysitter, and my father's in and out of incarceration, and so the streets became my disciplinarian, and I was raised by my neighborhood and the neighborhood kids, and and the drug took all that shame and embarrassment and not feeling like I was as good as everybody else. It took it away. It gave me a chance to escape the reality that I was living in. So long story short, 19 felony convictions later, in and out of incarceration, stuck in the loop of addiction, hopeless and helpless, broken, full of pain, full of an inability to accept my personal responsibility. Finally, at 38 years old, I broke. Like, something in me broke, and I was found non-responsive in a car with a substantial amount of illicit substance on me. And I remember thinking that my life was over as I knew it, right? Like, I'm 38 years old. I'm on my way back to prison for the 6th time. And at this point, if they let me go, I will be too old to enjoy a normal life, or I would die in prison. And those were the terms I came to accept.
Jimmy's story illustrates the frequent interaction of substance abuse and the justice system.
Of those in Arkansas that we incarcerate, substance abuse is a major factor in the crimes. But a lot of the violent crimes is substance abuse is surrounding that. If you're dealing, you're trying to mark out your territory, there are threats to your business. The people that you're selling to are not necessarily, their behavior is erratic. Or if you're an addict, if you are truly addicted to the substance, then you are much more likely to engage in illegal activity to be able to support that habit. You're probably going to start stealing from friends and family first, and then that may actually move out to businesses and breaking into houses. And so, substance abuse leads to crime, which will then lead to victims and then lead to incarceration.
The issue of substance abuse came up when Paul spoke with John Phillips, chairman of the Arkansas Parole Board, about the likelihood of released individuals returning to incarceration.
Can we talk a little bit about what goes into recidivism, just your observation over, 20 plus years on the parole board? What are the things that are really kind of tripping folks up?
The addiction issue is just such a moat around our necks, if you would, trying to deal with regular life issues. But then in addition to that, they're dealing with an addiction, which really, for them, they feel like the playing field's just not fair. And from that, they tend to violate other terms of their conditions of parole. The family reunification is such an important factor for me. And again, specifically talking about addictions, it's just really mind-boggling to see what the drugs have done to families. I've had individuals before to tell me, I can't go back home. everybody in my family uses methamphetamine. And if I go back, I'm doomed for failure then.
Again, from Kirk Lang.
I would say that probably 80% or more of the people that we have incarcerated have some type of drug nexus that got them there. And so I think we really need to think about how we're focused and how that law enforcement interacts with people that are on those substances or dealing with those problems. Maybe reverting or converting those people to some type of drug treatment and recovery, and really focus on the people that are distributing the poison that is out there, especially illicit fentanyl, and holding those people responsible. Up until the last couple of years, law enforcement, when they responded to a fatal overdose or a non-fatal overdose, never investigated past the overdose. And so for once, we are now starting to investigate past the overdose, trying to hold those people responsible. But interesting in the fact that we have built partnerships on our overdose response team, not only sending law enforcement, but also sending a peer recovery specialist to deal with the family and interact with the family, because a lot of times the family may be utilizing too, or I say the family or the people around this victim may be using too, or may be struggling with that concept, and there is nothing for families presently, on a fatal overdose or counseling out that is formalized in that.
In these comments, Director Lang referred to peer support specialists. This brings us back to Jimmy McGill, whose story did not end after that wrong turn into Lono County.
I didn't understand. God had a very different plan for me, and it took all of that, right? And so at 38 years old, that hopelessness was hitting. It just hit me different, and I knew that if I ever got a chance to live life again, that I would make the best of it. And here I am, 45 years old, and despite that plethora of self-imposed disadvantages, I'm a husband, a good husband, a provider, with a job in government. In 2017, I became the first parolee to take a state position. And I was tasked with a very new job, a very big job, and I've not just been successful at it. God has positioned me to use that past that was so full of shame and embarrassment and stigma. It became a pathway, not just for me, but for a nation of people. Currently, I'm the Director of Peer Recovery Services for the state of Arkansas, which means I develop, implement, and evaluate peer recovery programs from everything from the criminal justice system to forensic peer support to the training, the certification, the emergency room programs. Anywhere you see peer recovery, it probably tied into my job somewhere along the way. The peer program consists of the way it works, right? Like along my, I was an IV drug user for 23 years. And along that way, there were a whole lot of very qualified, and this is what I want to say, they were really good at their job, I'm sure of that. The problem was never them, it was me. And I also want to say this, I was never a victim, I was a volunteer. I always knew right from wrong, and I made a conscious decision to do wrong, right? Now, those decisions led me into a pathway of something I couldn't stop doing, and it became a lifestyle, and it was all I knew, and it was all I could do. But there were a lot of teachers, a lot of preachers, a lot of psychiatrists, a lot of therapists. There were a lot of mentors, a lot of mental health paraprofessionals, you name it. If there was a certification or a licensed person who could help me, they took a stab at it, and they never got anywhere. And it wasn't on them, it was on me. I never gave them a chance. I immediately shut down. And the reason for that was I was afraid that if I was honest with you, you would judge me, right? There's this shame and stigma of all the wrong that I've been doing for decades. The way peer recovery really works is when another person in recovery, see, I can sit down with somebody who's shot dope for 20 years and say, hey, I get it. I've been there too. I'm a Hep C survivor too. There's nothing you've been through that I haven't been through, if not worse. And instantly, that fear of being judged is removed. You're no longer worried about if I'm going to be condescending towards you. And so in a matter of seconds, another person in recovery had accomplished what clinical people had been trying to accomplish for decades. They broke through that wall of hardened exterior like it was nothing, just by sharing their lived experience with me. It empowered me, and I knew it was real, right? That's the key. It was authentic. I knew that what he had just told me was 100% the truth because I had lived it. I knew it. He spoke a language that only I would understand. That's the nature of peer support. So when we train someone and we put these qualifications, so you got to be 2 years clean, right? Abstinence-based recovery. Unless you're on MAT, there is an MAT waiver, which is medically assisted treatment. Now, that means I haven't smoked any marijuana, I haven't taken any pills, I haven't had one drink of alcohol, not in over 2 years, right? And so once I meet that requirement, then I can go through a week-long training. Once I get trained, I've got 500 hours of supervision I've got to go under. And then I can take the state exam. And then 100 of those hours out of that 500 is very domain specific. Recovery and wellness, ethics, responsibility, mentorship and education, right? These 25 hours I have to get under each one of these domains. And then I have to receive supervision from a seasoned peer recovery supervisor, someone who does what we do, specific to the field we're in, and nothing but that.
The state's put a lot of effort into the peer recovery model, training people with lived experience, different models all the way across the board, from a basic, advanced, and now a supervision model. When somebody goes through a class, they're required to do 500 hours of voluntary service, or what we say, they can actually go to work somewhere and do that 500 hours, and after that 500 hours and that criteria is met, then they can test for their national certification. And then once that's completed and they successfully pass that, then they can move to the next level. We've trained 400 plus peer recovery specialists in the state to date. Since it really got formalized in about 2019, over 200 have received their national credentialing in one level or another. And then they can go to work at a treatment location, they can go to work at a hospital, they can go to work at different employment. We're getting a lot of calls from employers wanting peers hired to help, working on a mindset right now to put a peer recovery specialist in every drug court in the state. And it makes perfect sense, you know, to have somebody there that has been through the fire, that can lead people through the fire.
Yeah, so the primary purpose of a peer is to support. And so they use that lived experience to help people navigate a very complicated system that they've already successfully navigated. You may be reentering society and need food stamps and driver's license, and you don't know who to contact or call. So I do, because I've already been through that and I'm trained. The same way I hustled the streets in addiction, I know who to call in the system to get you what you need. If you need a 31-day bus pass, I know who to call in all 75 counties to get you that. You may be reentering society from drug treatment. You got 30 days substance free. And society expects you to know how to navigate that system with a brain that is not functioning to capacity because you've been clouding it with drug use. Now, the system is already complicated and complex, and we want you, who can't think clearly, to float your way through this, and that's where peer support comes in.
The need for peer support brings us back to Mischa's story of the mother whose addiction separated her from her children.
Even if she got clean, and I'm not being critical of systems, but it wasn't just facing a heroin addiction. She faced a long list of either pending or charges or prior convictions that would make it almost impossible for her to get a job. She had a long list of fines that she had to pay off. She had no money for rent. She had no money. She had no money for really buying groceries. These are not things that just can be fixed overnight. So even if she got clean, and even if she could make it through substance abuse treatment, she knew that she had created 10 years of a path that was going to make it was going to take more than just getting clean to be able to get back to stability, not only for herself, but then think about the three kids that she would have had to try and navigate taken care of too. I mean, I can't hardly even fathom that mountain that she had to climb. That was step one was just getting clean. Then the mountain was still there of how do I get up this mountain to stability. It's huge. It's overwhelming for me to even think about. And I don't have a fix for it. I'm just saying I have empathy for what she was going to face to get back to stability. She did create that path on her own, but us as a society just continuing to be like, well, that's your fault and that's it. Like, well, that's not going to help our community either, because now we have 3 kids that are traumatized, that have gone through a ton, and that the state is paying for. So just that continued attitude of, well, that's your fault and you created that path, doesn't really get us anywhere to her being stronger, to being an active member of society. And ultimately, that's what we want, right? We want people to be an active member of society.
And now you look at Misty, and Misty who works for me at DHS, and she's our peer recovery training coordinator. She's been in the system. She lost her children to the system. Her vision is to take that lived experience, knowing that she can't have her babies back, but she can be there for parents who are going through what she went through. That's the beauty of lived experience, right? And it's as old as mankind. Veterans, they have support groups. People who are suicidal have support groups. Doctors share with other doctors. Law enforcement have law enforcement. Peer support has always been there. Arkansas is the national leader for recovery support services. And that was because we had a state drug director who challenged the status quo, right? Kirk Lane said, listen, what we're doing is not working. The recidivism rate's 56%. Addiction's at an all-time high. Overdose is at an all-time high. What we're doing doesn't work. If it did, we wouldn't be in this mess. And he challenged society and the government. And he went to the governor, and the governor signed off on my background. Being on parole with such a criminal history, they took a huge risk on me, and we changed the face of a nation. How do we take the relationship between Jimmy McGill and Kirk Lane and replicate it? See, the missing piece that we haven't talked about is Kirk Lane was my arresting officer and put me in prison. And he was also the man who hired me, right, to do what I do. So when it came time for me to share my recovery, he knew better than anybody that my recovery was real and it was authentic. This guy who once put the handcuffs on me, my nemesis by nature, was now my biggest champion and fighting for me to have a position in a system that is broken.
I think most importantly to me is when we started this program, the law enforcement side said, I don't know if I really want to be around a peer. Do we really need to have them as part of this grant? The peers were a little uncomfortable about being around the law enforcement, but now you can't separate them and they see the value and they've learned from each other. Law enforcement's got a good concept now of what addiction or a substance use disorder is all about, and they have a better mindset to it. They're more open to saying, hey, this is a person that really needs to be going to treatment instead of to jail, and they're leading them that way, and then really focusing their attention and their efforts on the dealer who's spreading the poison and holding them accountable. Where the other side is that peer recovery specialist is working with the family to try to get them the love and support and the needs that they have in there. And it's really generating some good response and some communication. The peer also works in the community trying to destigmatize drug addiction or substance use disorder in there and really educating not only the department but the community also. So we're pretty proud of this project that we have moving forward.
And so we reach and get people who are re-entering society, and we watch them and elevate to a position of status instead of recidivate. And we've got the data to prove it. And it's legit numbers. It's not make-believe, like we can put the body to the number and produce the proof.
And I'll give you an example of one up in North Arkansas in Izard County. It's a multi-county task force. They have 2 investigators and they have 2 peer recovery specialists. They respond to an overdose together. In the last year, they have arrested and indicted in federal indictments 6 people involved in around 2 deaths, but they've also led over 60 people to treatment and recovery at the same time, working in a partnership.
Men and women that society said would always be nothing are now champions, and the same neighborhoods that condemn them are depending on them. And that's the beauty of this thing.
I'm so excited that we've adopted and have rolled out with Kirk Lane kind of leading the way, and then Jimmy McGill being the head of the peer support program here in Arkansas. But a peer is someone who has lived experience. I'd say, we as a people need to really work on the demand side is let's try to prevent first use. And if use starts to occur, we need to have interventions and at every point. And you're going to know when folks start to decline. They're going to wind up in district court, if not in felony court, in jail. And so have these interventions early on so that the journey out of the hole isn't as great. But that offers of help occur at any level. If someone wants help, that's when we should have the services that exist in all of our communities should be ready to step in and help someone and encourage them along that journey. And I'd say here in Arkansas, we've got several communities actually that have created a fully connected pathway, though, all the way to career. It's not a straight line, but they keep on the pathway to career because we have the appropriate coaches in their lives that are helping them realize that they can go forward, and then helping them find out what that pathway might be. We have an employee who their children were taken into foster care a number of years ago, and they became a client of ours. That was really due to substance abuse around methamphetamine and other things.
Amanda and Patrick Myer.
Yes, we moved to Fort Smith in August of 2018 and didn't know anybody. We had started using meth, and in July of 2019, our kids were taken by DHS after an argument one night and the cops being called. We were high, and so they had to take the children since we were going to jail.
When they first came, they had her upstairs, and they had me in the cop car alone. And a DHS lady came walking by with the kids, and it was just right then. I don't know. I just had I realized my decisions, because they weren't mistakes; they were all decisions, and because I knew it was bad, and I was just seeing my kids. They've been dealing with my decisions for a while, but I finally seen them deal with extreme, because now they're paying the price. My daughter's scared; she don't know what's going on, and that's when it was time.
When we got out of jail, we were calling DHS, and we didn't have a caseworker assigned yet or anything like that. It was just the worker that was on call that night. So she left her card, and I was like, I don't know what to do, but tell me something to do. How do we get started? And so she told us to start with parenting classes. So we called Steps and got signed up in the parenting class before we had court or anything. And that's where we heard about 100 Families.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Karen Phillips, and I direct the 100 Families Initiative for Restore Hope, and I also direct operations. When we first started 100 Families, we wanted to provide supports with families that had DCFS cases. So either their children had been placed in care, or they had a protective services case where the children were still in the home, but they needed additional supports in order to keep their children safe. I met Patrick and Amanda at the Arkansas Community Corrections building, where I officed as a 100 Families case manager. I immediately really felt a bond with both of them, and I will never forget Patrick in particularly. He just broke down into tears that very first appointment. And he just admitted, he said, we messed up, you know, and now our children are suffering because we made a decision. I remember them saying, we will do whatever it takes. They were, you know, one of the few that kind of immediately realize how wrong they were and immediately want to change. And it was a bumpy ride.
We didn't know what our next step was. We were trying to fight, you know, urges to use. And in that moment, that's when you want to use the most, when you're in that situation and it feels like everything's falling apart. So of course that's what you want to turn to, but if you do, it's just going to make it worse. I think from start to end, our case was about 6 months long. But then afterwards, you know, we had to deal with, we were still drug addicts. We still had to deal with that. And then...
we still deal with it today.
Yeah, it's something...
How do you do that?
At first, I don't know, it's a scream, you know, and then after a while, you just ignore it. And after a while, it just becomes sometimes just a quiet thought.
I think for me, just looking back at all that we had to go through and how hard it was, and to think about doing that again and what the kids had gone through.
That it did end up relapsing at one point. And that was just such a hard time. But addiction is such a strong evil, and it comes back multiple times, and you know, statistics show that it takes, you know, several times to fully recover, you know, and that, you know, recovery is a lifelong process and all these things. But thankfully, they started back out at ground zero. I mean, they had to go to a homeless shelter at that time. They'd lost their housing we'd helped them to get. It was like starting all over again. And they were, and so they did. They did everything that was asked of them. You know, once again, they persevered and really, you know, just worked hard, you know, got employment.
They went on a journey fixing those things, taking care of the kind of the consequences, the suspended driver's license, no work, that kind of thing. Got their kids back in their home. There were issues that they had to address from their children, trauma of their children being out of the home and now back in. And then she came on as a case manager for us, but as a peer.
Amanda was going to beauty school. She had been, you know, clean a good while now. Everything was going well, and I just said, "How do you like beauty school?" I hate it. I'm not cut out for this. This isn't what I want to do with my life. I was like, "Oh, you know what? You'd be a great case manager." Thankfully, you know, Paul, you know, interviewed her and agreed, and
now goes into a juvenile court in partnership with that judge and that court as clients, just like she was many years ago, are in the same situation. And in the first 2 months that she was on the job, she doubled the client load in that particular county.
You know, coming from the place where she's been and all that she's been through, she takes all of that and puts it into every single, you know, life that she touches and helps, and she just helps get reunited, helps get into housing, helps get into, you know, get into recovery, all those life lessons that she's learned the hard way.
Because she could go to someone in a way that you or I couldn't.
Yeah.
And say, it looks like you're in a really dark hole, and I'm so sorry. I've been in that exact hole. You want some help? Because I got out, another way out.
You know, it's not always the easiest thing to do to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but I would be willing to bet that all of these parents love their kids, they just have some demons that are bigger, and sometimes it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of things that they haven't dealt with, but to have the families reunited and the children get to come home to their parents that love them is all worth it. And those parents need that help, and they don't know what to do.
And then she can bring that individual, build a relationship with the person that was in the exact same situation, and help them start putting a plan together to reunite their families or preserve their families if it hadn't gotten that far yet, get substance abuse treatment, get into housing, get into a jobs program, and be able to get stable enough that they start to make a relapse much less likely.
Yes, I have had some clients get reunited with their kids. It's really great. I cry every time. Even if they're not my client. And I go to the DCFS court on Wednesday, so even if they're not mine, I cry. And it's just to be in that environment and feel those emotions that I know that I felt before, and even ones, that didn't end up the way ours did, like families that get the rights terminated. Just to know that you've been in that situation and that could have been you too. It's overwhelming, but it's great to get to be there for those families.
There's a TED Talk that became quite popular, so it went viral a number of years ago. And the quote that came out of that talk was, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety or abstinence, it's connection. And so the individual, the author, kind of wrote about this study that was done where substances were offered to, narcotics were offered to rats, and if they were isolated, they'd descend full into the addiction process. But if you had kind of this community where they had relation with each other and they could play and work and do these things, then even though the narcotics were offered, they just didn't descend into addiction. They chose not to use, which then goes back into, I think, what the hospitals and the medical staff have realized is the social determinants of health. And so if things are good at home, and you feel like you have deep relationships with both family and friends, if you have a meaning, a transcendent, a meaning bigger than you, you're working on a cause, you feel like you at work are playing an appropriate role, your work matters, then the likelihood that you're going to be susceptible to substance abuse is greatly diminished.
Drug addiction destroys relationships. We become a whirlwind, and it becomes, like I said, it's a disease of isolation. It expresses itself in isolation, which makes diagnosis and treatment and detection almost impossible. Regardless of your pathway to recovery, one of the things that you have always got to have is community, right? Like community, health, home, and purpose. Those are the 4 elements of recovery. And regardless if you have a church-based platform for recovery, 12-step, CrossFit, natural recovery, smart recovery, it doesn't matter. You can be a part of a bicycle community. If you practice your pathway daily, you have a purpose and you have a community that wants to see you strive and live clean, and you've got a healthy home and your health, mental health is right, then you can sustain recovery. So health, home, purpose, and community. Community to me being the most important, second being purpose.
I think I find hope in the families that are learning, the families that are coming together. There's a lot of different programs that are out there. I find hope in the win of recovery and listening to people that have recovered, that are now becoming those strong spokesmen and advocates. I look at those and those families that are now stepping up, that may have lost or have won, with their child. however old that child is. You know, a lot of times they're talking about their children and they're 20, 30 years of age, but they're still with them. They're still giving them the chance instead of isolating them. To me is the win-win that I see. And then I think thirdly, I think there are young people that are stepping up now and becoming role models, especially those that are trying to educate their families and their communities. Because when I talk to those children, why are you doing this? And there are a lot of saying that they may have tried it or they didn't choose to try it. Because when I went to high school, nobody died of a drug overdose in the late 70s. But now most of the kids I talk to know 5 or 6, and they don't want that anymore, and they don't see that. We're even seeing that in the education of doctors when we had that over-prescribing problem, which we still do. But a lot of our younger doctors and medical professionals grew up in a society that they saw a lot of overdoses, and so now they're trying to educate them to be more efficient and use the tools that are there and develop tools to get them to prescribe smarter, to get them to understand when somebody comes in and has an addiction, and instead of running them out of their doctor's office, they're now encouraging them to come in and helping them by giving them tools about treatment and recovery that they never utilized before.
So the more we talk about recovery, the more we normalize it. And the more we talk about addiction, the more we humanize it, right? And so friends and allies of recovery, it's not us versus them. It's us versus the stigma. And when I say us, I mean the advocates who believe in this. I think about my wife's mother, my mother-in-law. Every time one of us has a recovery celebration or we have this big accomplishment or achievement, her mother will post a picture of us and hashtag it, "They do recover." Yeah. So, I didn't mean to get all emotional right there, but it's a beautiful thing to see other people fight for us, right? Because addiction doesn't just affect the person using, it affects everybody. It affects the community, it affects the family, it affects the criminal justice system, it affects everything. And, I think education is the key, right? The more we speak up, the louder we get, the more lives we save. That could be lives from the person using, or it could be lives that the stigma is trying to kill.
If you or someone you love is struggling with substance abuse, do not isolate. There are resources available. Reach out. You might find a new way to live. Thank you for joining this episode of Smart Justice. Join us next week as we consider the impact and possible new approaches to the issues of incarceration.
Special thanks to this episode's guests, Mischa Martin, Kirk Lane, John Phelps, Jimmy McGill, Amanda and Patrick Myer, and Karen Phillips. Thanks also to Churches for Life for sponsoring. Music credits include H2O by Lee of the Stone, Lonely Company by Anthony Catacoli, At the Heart of It by Tyam, Through the Looking Glass by Moments, and Silver Horizon by Ariel Red. Music was licensed through Soundstripe.com. Smart Justice is a work of Restore Hope. Please consider helping us produce more work like this by becoming a donor at www.smartjustice.org. Thanks again.